Hello guys, so in this video we are going to study the basics and the concept, the idea behind the Italian opening. So what is an Italian opening? Italian opening goes like this. So it starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to c4. So that is called the Italian opening. So we are going to analyze the idea behind this opening. So basically, it is a straightforward opening controlling the center in the first few moves. Okay, so e4, e5, that is a central move. By moving the pawn to e4 and by moving the pawn to e5, this is a battle for central occupancy. Okay, and immediately white tries to attack the hanging pawn on e5. So as you can notice, the pawn on e5 is hanging as well as the pawn on e4, right? So black's pawn on e5 is hanging. Well, the white has an advantage here because white moves first, right? So the ability of white to attack immediately, attack that hanging pawn immediately, gives a slight advantage. Okay, so what can black do here? The straightforward defense here would be knight c6, right? So knight c6 doesn't only develop the knight but also protects the hanging pawn at the same time. So knight c6 is a good move, okay? But there are other moves that black can do to defend that pawn, right? Maybe d6, but d6 will make it the Pilidor defense, okay? So it won't be the Italian game anymore, okay? That's the Pilidor defense. So to stay in line, knight c6, okay? Because knight c6 develops the knight and protects the pawn on e5. All right. Okay, and now white moves the bishop to c4, striking along this diagonal and focusing on the weak pawn on f7. All right. Okay, so there are different moves here for or responses here for black. Okay, so let's study. So maybe you are thinking, okay, you are attacking my pawn, I will attack yours as well. So maybe you are thinking of moving the knight to f6. Knight f6 attacks the pawn, all right? And this is the two knights defense, okay? Two knights defense. This is quite risky, okay? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Why this is risky? Because black allows white to place the knight on g5. So what happens when white places the knight on g5? As you can see, like I mentioned, the pawn on f7 is weak. Why? Because the king is the only defender to that pawn. And now that the knight jumps to g5, there are two attackers to that pawn already. So black must do something about it. And the only logical move is to push the pawn to d5, which covers the line of the bishop to f7. All right? So what happens if the pawn on e4 captures on? Okay. Again, after this move, there are some options for black here. One is the obvious, which is to capture, right? Maybe you're thinking of capturing the knight or the pawn on d5. So what will happen if we capture the pawn on d5? Okay, so this is a mistake. Okay, knight takes d5 is a mistake. Why? Because of this knight sacrifice. After this, knight takes f7. If the king captures on f7, the next move will be what? Yes, if you're thinking of queen to f3, then your answer is correct. Why? Because queen f3 forks the knight and the king. Okay? So now, even if the king goes to e6, for example, the next moves will be devastating for black. Knight c6, and now black must defend the knight, because if you are going to count, by counting, we can see that there are two defenders at the moment, right? And there's a bad pin here, okay? The knight is being pinned by the bishop, okay, against the king. So there are two defenders and three attackers. So basically, this is losing for black. So he must add another defender to that knight, okay? And the best move that black can do here is to move the knight to b4, right? Knight to b4, defending further the knight on d5. And now, there's a threat of capturing the pawn on c2. So, to avoid that fork right there, white can castle, right? And now black can add another defender to the knight on d5 by pushing the pawn to c6. All right? And then you can see that materially, black is up. All right, black is actually up a piece, because as if you are going to count, black has complete minor pieces, two knights and two bishops, whereas white has only one knight. Okay, but the position of black here is quite bad, because the king wasn't able to castle, and the king is at the center of the board. So white must do something to break that central pawn. And the most direct way to break that central pawn is by pushing the pawn to d4. Okay? And queen f6 is the best move here to just simply challenge the queen and simplify the game. And if the game is further simplified, black might win in the end game. Okay? But of course, white will not trade the queen, because that would be a bad move. Okay? So queen e2, so something like that. So the game here is quite bad for black positionally, but materially black is an advantage. So if we're going to go back to this position, okay. So after the capture, okay. So let's go further back. So knight g5, knight f6, okay, knight f6. The move knight f6 allowed white to place the knight on g5, attacking the f7 pawn, okay? And the only defense for black is to push the pawn to d5. White captures, and now we have seen that knight takes d5 is risky, okay? That is risky because of this move, queen to f3, or maybe knight takes knight takes f7, sacrificing the knight. Okay, so if we are not going, if black is not going to capture the pawn, what are the other options for black here? Well, the most popular option for black here is knight to a5, kicking the bishop. Okay, and the best option for white here is to move the bishop to b5, giving a check, and then it continues, b takes e6, then bishop to d3. Okay, so this position is somewhat equal, but white has a slight advantage, but it is somewhat equal. So knight a5 is a good move actually. So if you do not want this early complication, early in the game, then you should avoid, so after bishop c4, you should avoid knight f6 immediately. Why? Because of knight g5. If you want to avoid that complication, then don't do knight f6. So what are the other options here? The other options here for black is maybe to develop the bishop to c5, and this becomes the Duoco piano. Okay, so bishop to c5, that's Duoco piano. Or black can try bishop to b4, and this is still a line in the Italian game. Okay, or maybe black can try d6. Okay, what are the other options here? Maybe knight to e7. So those are options here for black. a6 is an option as well. a6 or h6, preventing the knight jump. Okay, so there are lots of different options here, but developing moves are better than pawn moves in the opening. Okay, so the better developing moves are bishop to c5, perhaps the Duoco piano, or sometimes the passive bishop to e7, the Hungarian defense. So this is the Hungarian defense, bishop to e7. So that makes the difference. The extent of which you move the bishop determines the kind of opening that you are actually playing. So if we move the bishop to e7, that's the Hungarian defense. If we move the bishop to d6, that's also a line in the Italian game, but that is a bad move. You know why? Because you are blocking the central pawn. You will not be able to push the central pawn, and you are also not allowing your light squared bishop to be developed. So it's not common to do a bishop to d6, but it is playable, but it's not a very good move. So the best moves here are bishop c5 and bishop to e7. All right, and also knight f6 is not bad if you consider it. Knight f6 is not bad. a6 is not bad as well, but it is better to move the minor pieces. Knight f6, that's the two knights defense. Bishop to e7, Hungarian defense. Bishop to c5, Duoco piano. All right. Okay, so let's go for the Duoco piano, which makes the board somewhat symmetrical, right? So after that, what are the options for white here? So white can prepare for the central push by moving the pawn to c3. Okay, so this is the main line of the Duoco piano, and that's the idea. c3, preparing for the push, for the d4 push. Okay, and if However, white tries something like the passive d3. That is still good, but this variation is called the Gioco Pianissimo variation. All right. How about if white tries something like knight to c3? So it's still doable. It is doable. Knight c3, and it's playable, and it is a centralizing move as well. But that prevents white from pushing the d4 pawn early in the game. Okay, because he decided to develop the knight immediately. But that is playable, and that is a good move as well. So depending on your game preparation, for example, if you know your opponent, and you know his opening repertoire, then you can do a home preparation. So if he is doing the Gioco Piano and he is familiar with the C3 variation here, which is the main line, then do something else. And one other option here, maybe if you're thinking of maybe fianchettoing the bishop here, that's also doable. So there are lots of options actually, but the main line is C3, okay, and that is for the Gioco Piano. All right. Now, if for example, black decides to move the bishop to e7, the Hungarian defense. Okay, so the better move here for white is just to castle, right? And the idea here is by developing the bishop first, doing the knight move in the next move won't be a problem even after white tries something like knight to g5. You know why? Because castling will solve it. Okay, so let's see that. For example, white castled, and then the black moves the knight to f6, and then now knight g5 won't be that scary. Why? Because of this move. Black castles, there's no more threat of capturing the pawn on f7. Okay, so that's the idea behind the Hungarian defense: developing the bishop first, and then move the knight, develop the knight. Okay, how about d6? This is somewhat passive, okay, but it does two things. Okay, it opens the line for this bishop to go out and be active, but at the same time it blocks the line of this bishop, of this dark squared bishop, and this bishop will become passive for the rest of the game. Okay, so that it's a matter of choosing which bishop do you want to be active in the game. But of course there are ways to activate your minor pieces. But if you prefer close games, then you can opt for d6. Okay, that is an option as well, and it's not a bad move. Okay, and h6 is an option as well. So there are lots of different options, and there are lots of different variations that may result depending upon the response of black and white to each and every move of their opponent. Okay, but the main line, the main moves of the Italian opening is, again, let's repeat that: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4. And The rest will depend on how the players will play their game. Okay? So I hope you learned something from this. There are other tricky things on in this opening, and there are traps and saps in this opening as well. And if you are not careful and you are not familiar with this opening, then your opponent might crush you. So that's why it is important to, even if, whatever opening you are using, whatever opening you are facing against, it is really important to develop your pieces early in the game and to be able to castle, especially if you are new to chess. King safety is priority. Okay, but of course, um, you must respond to the threats as the game progress. It's not a matter of, oh, I will need to castle, so you will just move blindly whatever. Okay, it's not how it goes. Of course, if you see that your opponent commits a mistake early in the game, you must be able to exploit it. Okay, like for example, if in this early stage your opponent moves knight f6, which is not a mistake. Okay, but after knight to g5, for example, he moved the pawn to d6. Now that is a mistake. Why? Because knight f7, knight takes f7, forks the queen and the rook. All right. So after the queen moves, for example, if the queen moves to maybe, or maybe the black encounter with bishop to g4 first, but that's useless. Okay, then queen d7, and now the knight can take h8, and white is winning in material here. All right, so that's how you exploit weaknesses, and exploit and take advantage of the mistakes of your opponent. So after knight g5, for example, your opponent does something strange, like maybe bishop to e7, which is a very big mistake. You know why? Because after knight takes f7, the queen has no escape square. So the queen will be captured in the next move. So that's why you need to develop your pieces, but also be aware of your opponent's move and respond accordingly. So if your opponent is doing logical moves in the opening, like here, for example, and he captures that. So what are the options here? What are the options? Actually, there are lots of different options here, but the best is knight takes f7, as I have demonstrated earlier. For example, after queen to f3, what black did is he went to g8, then that's a mate in 3. Okay, why? Because after bishop takes, queen takes, so the king is mated in this corner. All right, so that is a mistake. So that's how you exploit the mistakes. Queen f3, if your opponent goes somewhere, like for example he goes back here, then you're winning because the knight is hanging. So the only logical move here is to defend the knight by moving the king closer to the knight. And this is risky because the king is at the center, even though black is up a piece at this point. All right. So that is how you respond. You do not just blindly, oh, okay, this is the opening line that I've memorized. Okay.
So after this, I'll move this one, and then I'll castle, and then it's not that way. So you must respond to your opponent's move. Okay? If your opponent does something which is not according to the sound principle of the opening, then you can exploit that mistake, and you can take advantage of that. All right? So I hope you learned something about the Italian game in this video. And in the next videos, we will discuss other things about this opening and the other variations that arises from different responses by black and by white in different scenarios. Okay, so thank you very much, and have a good day, have a good evening.